Hi everyone, this is Selvi. Today's interview question is, what is invest? Invest is the characteristics of the user story. So we all have discussed already in our previous episodes about user stories. So today we are going to discuss about the characteristics. So characteristics is mentioned in a short term called invest. So we will try to understand each and every character and what it is trying to explain. The first one is I. I stands here for independent. A user story should be an independent one. For example, when we are creating a user story, we should ensure that there is no coupling already available with other user stories. For example, if I complete this, then only I can pick up the other user story. Or if I complete the design of front end in another user story, then I will be having another user story which talks about the backend. Then already there is a connection which is available. It is not independent, it is already dependent work item, which is not a good scenario. We should always ensure every user story is an independent work item. How to ensure this? It is very simple. First of all, as I mentioned, there should not be any separate user story for design, separate user story for front end, separate user story for back end, separate user story for testing. This concept is not at all good. And another thing is, there should not be any dependency between two functionalities. For example, we are creating a user story that is related to login, which only talks about username, password, and then there is something called as checking the validation for username and password. This is one story. And next story, we will be implementing the functionality for submit. This is also not good because it is a single page where we have username as one text field, password is another text field, submit is a button that is available which provides the functionality. If we are not doing that, that means how it will be? There is a page where you can enter username, where you can enter password. Validation also will happen, maybe at the UI level or maybe from the backend also. Whatever may be the validation, but there is no other functionality. We need to develop this, then only we can develop the actual functionality of submit, because that is a separate story. This also is not a good scenario. How it should be? It should be a single user story where it should talks about username, password, submit, in which we will be also doing the validation. This is how a story should be. So in short, a story, any user story, should be created in such a way it is an independent work item. It should not have any dependency with other user stories. Next point, N. N is for negotiable. When we say negotiable, what does it mean? User story content should not be something as a static content. What is static and what is dynamic here? When we write, for example, when product owner is designing the user story, it will have certain use cases, it will be having certain points in the acceptance criteria, it may have actually some kind of clarity available. But what will happen? It actually gives us the space, gives us means here the team, to negotiate on the points. What will happen in our backlog refinement meeting? As a part of discussion, we negotiate on these points. As a team, we ask certain details to be added, we ask certain details to be removed, product owner gives some kind of suggestions. As a team, we negotiate and we come to a kind of complete agreement at the end. With that alignment, we will complete our refinement. So all user stories should allow product owner or any person to add the details, which means suggest the details, because everyone will not be having access to modify or keep on adding the things. Only they can suggest as a team, because generally product owner holds the complete ownership of the product backlog. So he or she, the product owner, is going to modify, add, remove all the things, basically the work item. So here the catch is, the team is going to provide information, so they also have option to negotiate the details. Product owner also has option to negotiate the details. So Every user story should not be something like a fixed statement. First we have written whatever we have written during the first draft phase, that should be the fixed one. It is a static content. We cannot remove, we cannot add, we cannot modify anything. That is not the case. What should be the case? It should allow for modification. There is an opportunity for negotiation from every team member, which will be updated by the product owner. So negotiation should be possible. Next one is V. V stands here for value. What is the business value that it is giving? Every user story should have a goal, and every user story should tie up with the business value. It should give some value. For example, if we are creating a user story, as an admin, I want to create a catalog page. I want to access the catalog page so that I can add or remove the products. So what is the value that we are giving? The value we are giving to the user type admin to access the page called catalog, where the admin can add or remove the products. So the addition and removal of products using the catalog page is provided to the admin user type. That is the value that we are providing with the help of the user story. So every user story should have some value associated with it. If there is no value at all, for example, again I am taking the same example. We are designing a page for login. Username field is there, label is there, password label is there, password field is there, submit button is there, cancel button is there. I can do everything. I can enter all the things, but the story was created in such a way I can see all these things in the UI. But when I enter a valid username or any username and password, when I click on submit, no function will work. There is no functionality developed. The submit button, basically, the backend was not created. Only the UI is available. What is the value that we are getting out of this? There is no value at all. Providing a UI page cannot be a value, because every user story, once it is completed, it should be in a position to be shipped. When I say shipped, at the end of the sprint, when we are creating or when we are developing this user story, once it is developed, this user story can be deployed in the environment, whereas there should not be any kind of issue. It should work in the production environment. That is the way our user story should be delivered. That means we cannot have only UI. We should have the backend functionality. We should have the core functionality. When we say the core functionality, that means it should deliver a value. So if the value is not available, if it is not providing any value, then it is not an user story at all, because it is somewhere just a placeholder we have created to do some work. It is not a user story. So user story should give business value. How to ensure that it is giving a business value? Because every user story is associated with a goal. When we achieve the goal, automatically we deliver a value. That is what we call it as the logical outcome of the user story. So here we talk about value. So every user story should deliver a business value. What is the next one? E. E is estimatable. Every user story should be in a state of estimation. We cannot create such a user story that team members are saying, I can understand what we are trying to do, but I cannot even estimate, because it is having too many goals associated with it, and it is too big that I cannot even think of estimating, or I am not so clear what are the dependencies and what are the risks involved in it. Because what is estimation? Estimation is based on different factors like complexity, involved dependencies, involved risk, amount of work, business value that it is delivering. With all these factors only we are estimating a user story. Now, when team is unable to identify the dependencies, unable to understand the risk that is associated, that means there are still uncertainties, which means the user story is not clear, which means the user story is still can be broken down, but it is actually a huge story or maybe a huge piece of work that is available where team is unable to identify what are the dependencies, risk that are involved, unable to estimate it because they don't know the complexity of work. They still feel that there are a lot of uncertainties. We should not create a story in that fashion. Always, when a story is available, at the end of the refinement, when team is completely aware of what should be implemented, they should be also in a state to identify the involved risk, involved dependencies, what is the level of complexity, what is the amount of work that is required, what is the business value that is associated. These all information they should be able to understand. If the team is unable to understand, then there is a problem with the user story creation. The story is not actually a story which may have a lot of uncertainties. That's the reason team is not in a position to estimate it. So we should ensure that we are able to estimate the user story. That is the one of the characteristic, that is E. Now the next one is S, that is small. We should ensure as much as small we should break the user story. How is that possible? We need to now think about the other characteristics also. The important thing here is not only focusing on only one characteristic feature of the user story. We should ensure we are actually able to manage all these characteristic features, whatever we are discussing. That is invest. It should not only have small and negotiable. It should have independent, it should have negotiable, value providing story, estimatable, small, and even the last one is testable. We will be seeing it now. So now small is how to ensure that the user story is small. Can we break down into a level that it is called a small? No. We should ensure every user story is associated with only one goal. Simple example is sometimes user story is created in a fashion, let's perform all the CRUD operations, creation, update, deletion. No, it is not the right thing. Ensure that first you are adding a user. That is one user story. It is only targeting addition of user. Next, target modifying or editing the user details. That can be one more user story. Next one is deleting the user. So every user story is bringing a value. At the same time, it is associated with only one goal, and also it is small, so that it is easy for us to achieve it. And it is also easy for us to track it, easy for us to identify the dependencies, identify the risk, because it is small and it is also having only one goal, not so many goals associated in one story. That is what we call it as small. Next one is T, that is testable. User story should contain enough and sufficient details so that tester can go ahead and write the acceptance test based on the scenarios or use cases provided in the acceptance criteria of the user story. Simple catch here is how an user story is tested. Basically, we have some set of test cases. How are we going to write the test cases? Who is going to provide the information? User story is going to provide the information. Through a part called acceptance criteria, which is available in the user story. So now this acceptance criteria should have enough and sufficient details so that a tester can write acceptance tests which are required to test this user story. So when at the end, after implementing this user story, we will be using this acceptance test to ensure whether this user story is providing whatever we have expected out of it. For that, this acceptance tests are going to help us. So if acceptance tests are getting passed, that means it is very much fair enough statement to say okay, whatever we were expecting, we have covered all those things now because all the acceptance tests are passing. This is also one of the criteria we will ensure in our checklist called definition of done, so that we can ensure that all the acceptance tests are passed, which means whatever we have expected is taken care. One of the checklist item, not the only thing to ensure that, okay, this story is acceptable. No, there are many more things that we have already covered in our checklist called it a definition of done episode. Now, coming back to the topic of testable. So, every user story should have sufficient and enough details to ensure that we can test this user story with the help of acceptance test. So, that sufficient information should be available. So, if those information are not available in the user story, that means we can very well say that no, this story is not meeting the characteristic feature of the user story, because you cannot even think of what are the use cases or scenarios that need to be developed also, because even for a developer, acceptance criteria is very important for them to understand what they are going to implement. For tester, it is very important to create the acceptance test. So it should have all these testable items. For that, we should have sufficient information in the user story. Do we have that or not? This is one of the characteristic feature we need to check. So, in a nutshell, an user story should match the characteristic feature called invest, independent, negotiable, value, estimable, small, and testable. So, what we can say in one statement here is an user story should be an independent work item which should allow people to modify it, negotiate on the details, and come to a conclusion. And it should also be providing a business value, which means every user story should be associated with a goal, and it should also be in a position to estimate it. When we say estimation, we should be able to identify the dependencies, risk involved in it, what is the complexity, all the factors required for estimation should be available in the user story so that team can very well estimate it. It should not have uncertainties which allow team to unable to estimate. They will not be able to estimate it. So estimation is very important. So all the factors are very crisp and available so that team is able to, based on those factors, team is able to estimate it. Now, next is the user story should be small, which means they should not have multiple goals associated with it. It should have only one goal associated with it, and also it should be very crisp, and it should have a target, that is the single goal association in the user story. And the last one is testable. So it should have sufficient and enough details so that we can test the user story. So these all things we claim it is, all these characteristics are matching for a user story or a work item, then we say that user story is matching all the characteristic features that are required so that we can call it as actually an user story. What is the disadvantage if it is not matching any of these characteristics? The disadvantage here is there are high chances that this work item is not an user story, because of which we may face a lot of challenges. One is we may not actually estimate it properly. As it is not small, there are chances that it may have too many goals associated with it, and which will not fit in a sprint time. And if it doesn't have details about testing, then we cannot really test it properly, which may raise quality issues. And if it is not allowing any negotiation option, there are chances that it may also end up in a way that it is not allowing a good conversation during the refinement. If it is not independent, obviously there are dependencies. So there are high chances that we may get into a spillover, because we cannot resolve all the dependencies if too many dependencies are associated in a user story. If it is not providing a value, then it is not even called as a user story because it is just a placeholder item. So these are the disadvantages we will encounter if we are not having all these characteristic features available in the user story. So how to ensure this? Just to ensure you have a checklist item in your definition of ready stating that always your user stories should match this invest criteria, which is called as the characteristics of the user story. If it is not matching, please ensure that your product owner is updating this as per this invest guideline. Hopefully this episode would have helped every one of you in understanding what is invest. Thanks everyone for listening. Happy learning and stay tuned.